welcome. This is Bill Donahue with Discerning Truths, usually talking to you about Jesus. I'm going to, Mondays and Wednesdays, I typically go through a book of the Bible, and then on Fridays, I talk about subjects related to that. But next 2 weeks, I'm gonna take a little break from what I was normally, my normal schedule, because this week I'm going to present what is a cumulative case argument for the existence of God. And what a cumulative case argument is, what prosecutors put on in a court case against a defendant. They charge them, and then they present this piece of evidence, that piece of evidence, and it's not one piece of evidence that usually convinces the jury or the judge of a person's guilt or innocence. It's a cumulative effect of all the pieces of evidence. And when I went to college, initially at 17 years old, we didn't have guidance counselors. A professor in your major acted like a guidance counselor, and my major was philosophy. So my professor told me I was too smart to believe the myths that my parents and my church had taught me about God. I grew up in the church. I already thought I was the smartest person on the block, and then you just feed right into that ego, right? And who doesn't want to prove that he's smart? So I kind of set out, and I said, well, I'm kind of have this nagging guilt that God might exist and that he might expect things from me. And so I kind of sought out, and I looked at things in the Bible, and decided I could really, if I just disproved the resurrection, I would disprove Christianity. And then I could look at the arguments against the existence of God. It wasn't Allah or Buddha or Confucius or any Hindu god that I was having trouble with. It was the God of the Bible that I needed him there. So I went through that experience, and then I came to faith at that point, back to the faith, and basically knelt down at the foot of the cross and said, okay, here I am, God, use me, whatever. What do you expect from me? And then later on in life, I went in my 30s and 40s. I went back to college, and I took classes in Biola University's master's program in Christian apologetics. Wasn't looking for my master's in there. I took the classes I wanted, and I did it. And in one of the classes, there was an assignment. You had to write a paper on something, and I chose to produce this cumulative case argument for the existence of God. Now, back then, this was an academic paper. And so academic papers have footnotes and references. They're heavy. Any of you that have gone to college and done theses or that know what you have to do to present it. And then I had it for years. Actually, when I finished writing it, I came home and showed my wife, because I was very proud of myself. I was patting myself on the back how good a job I had done. And I had her read it, and she read it quietly and said, yeah, it's okay. And I'm thinking, what do you mean okay? I want, where's the band, And my wife's position was that to her, God is so obvious that any attempt to deny his existence is futile. It's like denying the nose on your own face. So we come at faith from two different things. I've always been like the Apostle Thomas, seeking proof and demanding where's the beef, My wife's faith is based on her personal experience, both with and about God, And no amount of evidence in the world is going to convince her that those experiences aren't real. God was as a real and present part of her life from the moment she wakes to the moment she goes to sleep. My wife will get quiet and break into prayer, dozens of times a day. She's very much in that relationship. She doesn't need evidence outside of that. I was always the guy who needed the evidence. And that's when what Jesus says to Thomas in John 20:29 hit me in the gut. And Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen yet have believed. And she really is blessed. to have that level of faith without needing the evidence. But I was that guy, and I am that guy that needs the evidence, that wants the facts, that questions everything. That's who I am. It's what I do. And I question everything, including God, you know? And I envied then, and I still envy now, the faith my wife has. There's no room for doubt for her. I watched her endure things that would have crushed most people. She not only forgave people who committed unspeakable offenses to her, but she repaid those offenses with love and forgiveness. God, I hope one day that I'm at that point. I'm not. Yet here I was still trying to erase the last element of doubt in my mind. Despite having taught Bible studies for decades, I mean, by the time my 30s and 40s, I was a Bible teacher regularly. My mind simply gravitates towards what's called partisan doubt. René Descartes was a philosopher, and he basically came up with a system of just systematic doubt, methodological doubt. And then he got down to where he doubted everything, even his own existence. And he questioned, there are things in philosophy that are called brute facts or properly basic, but even those philosophers have caused them to be in question. So we make assumptions. We have to make some assumptions just to be able to reason. And Descartes broke it down so bad that he got to the point where he says, I think, therefore I am. I must be. I think about these things, therefore I have to at least be real, right? I'm further than Descartes, because I've engaged the possibility that I could be in the imagination and the dream of God. But he could be dreaming these things, and I might not even be real. So when making judgments about the veracity of any proposition, if we're more than 50% convinced that a proposition is likely true, then that is belief. How much higher you are than 50% is how strong your belief is. If we're less than 50% convinced something is true, that's disbelief. You're not convinced it's true. On very rare occasions, you might actually be 50-50 in a state of complete uncertainty. But how certain a person can be about the level of their own uncertainty, right? I mean, if you're saying I'm uncertain, how certain can you really be about that? For these reasons, I don't ever expect to achieve absolute certainty concerning any proposition. Doesn't matter what it is, either in belief or disbelief. But I either believe or disbelieve each proposition to a varying degrees of certainty. Sometimes my certainty approaches 100%. I might describe that level of certainty as being 99% sure. There's always remains room for doubt for me. Other times I may only be 55% or 70% or 85% convinced of the veracity of any proposition. The same thing happens in disbelief. Sometimes I find very little, almost zero veracity in a claim. Other times I'm much closer to 50% threshold, but I fall short of belief, right? But if I'm somewhere between 50.1% convinced and 99.9% convinced, that's belief. And very often I find myself in the 60s, 70% convinced of the veracity of a claim. When I think a claim is falsified, it's because I'm in the 20 to 30%, right? I still leave the possibility it could be true, but I'm not convinced of the veracity of the complaint, of the thing, right? I doubt that they're actually aliens from other planets. I tend to think they are demonic expressions, paraphysical manifestations out of the celestial realm. But if it was proven, I have to leave open the possibility that maybe I'm wrong on that question. So even though I'm only 20% convinced that aliens, physical, created beings, physical beings, sentient beings living on other planets, I'm only like 20% convinced that that's true. I have to leave open because I have to admit that in my mind, it's possibly true. I think it's unlikely. If it turned out to be true, I have some theological questions I would have to answer, right? I mean, are they saved because Jesus is not one near of kin to them? How did that work with redemption? And did they suffer under the sin of Adam even though they had nothing to do with it? I have theological questions, but I'm not putting it out of my mind totally. And I'd mentioned that I'd written this cumulative case argument for the existence of God on multiple occasions. And several people asked me if they could read it, not the least of which was Neil, and expressed things. But I had a computer crash that my external hard drive was plugged into my computer when it crashed, and it spiked the hard drive. And I lost 25 to 30 years of everything I've written disappeared. I had no secondary backup. And, a lot of the research I did for the original paper and the recreation story, I'd done, originally when I was 17 to 19 years old. And then I did it for a paper again in my 30s and 40s. And I don't remember which age I was when I actually wrote this paper. But, 20 to 30 years ago, I wrote this. But the initial quest for truth back then, when I was 17, led me to a lifetime of research and study. Sometimes I consider my skepticism and partisan doubt a curse, but most often it's a blessing. Methodologically questioning everything I hear, read, even see with my own eyes has helped me navigate life and avoid being duped, not dumped. Duped on many occasions. So there's benefits to being the skeptic, right? So with that, I'm going to take you back a little bit and tell you my story. You're going to get a glimpse inside the mind of Bill Donahue. And it might be scary once you look inside there. But I grew up in a religious household. The existence of God and the truth of the resurrection of Jesus were ardently believed. But when I got to college, right, my philosopher test tells me I'm too smart, right? And if God didn't exist, I'm smart enough to know this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Subjective moral values might. Society can come up with moral values, but nothing is objectively good or evil. So if you can prove God does not exist and moral values do not exist, then you can live any way you think you can get away with. I mean, that's kind of psychotic if you think of it, but it is really the truth. And before we were called the baby boomers, my generation was called the me generation. And we were a cultural shift towards intense individualism, narcissism, self-fulfillment, moving away from collective social activism towards personal growth. My older brothers and sisters were kind of the little bit more in the age of the hippie movement and fixing society and changing society in ways that they thought were wrong. My peers were about us. We were about me. And we had into our finding ourselves and having high self-esteem, entitlement, and the pursuit of personal pleasure over any social obligation. Therefore, the idea of living according to my own set of values and not needing to adhere to someone else's morals is very attractive to me at the time. But when I tried it, I felt very guilty about some of the things I was doing. I tried to dismiss it, and I called it Catholic guilt. That was, growing up Catholic, that very much pushed guilt on you, right? And so I wanted to dismiss that. And I just thought, if I can just, get rid of that guilt, I can live happy and be the narcissist I want to be. And like I said, I wasn't being bothered by Allah, Vishnu, Shiva, Krishna, Buddha. They weren't causing me to feel guilt. It was the Christian God and Jesus and what they might expect from me that was bothering me. And I'm familiar enough with the scripture that I remember in 1 Corinthians 15, in verses 3 to 8, Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, and according to with the scripture, he was buried, and then he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scripture. And he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Most of them are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. He appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Paul makes the argument that truth or falsity of Christianity rises or falls on the veracity of the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. In 1 Corinthians 14:15. "And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching's in vain, your faith is in vain, and we have been found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised." Paul said Christianity rises and falls on a singular fact. That seemed to me like Paul gave me the way to disprove Christianity. All you had to do is disprove the resurrection. And I was well on my way to disproving the Christian God, right? One major step out of the way, right? And so this brings me up to the paper at Biola, where I kind of told that story and how I did this and my methodology that I went forward with this. I approached the interconnected questions of God's existence and the resurrection of Jesus. And I say interconnected because if God doesn't exist, then Jesus certainly didn't get out of the tomb. He didn't get out of the tomb by himself. But if I can show that Jesus did get out of the tomb, that's very strong evidence that God does exist, because there's no naturalistic explanation for that happening. Now, theism, the belief in God, a God or some kind of God that exists, and naturalism are worldviews. If we examine subjects with the assumption that God does or doesn't exist, we will reach different conclusions because of the assumptions of those diverse worldviews. If I assume the worldview of theism, then God necessarily exists. But if I assume the worldview of naturalism, then God necessarily can't exist. So by choosing your worldview, you've already predetermined your answer. The most intellectually honest way to begin the examination of the question of God's existence or his non-existence is with an openness to the possibility that God may or may not exist. And naturalism may or may not be true. Right? And even most skeptics now accept the evidence shows that Jesus was a real historical person who lived and ministered in the first century Judea and Galilee, was crucified under Pilate, and that very soon after his death, Christians were claiming that he had resurrected. That doesn't prove he resurrected. It's just those are the accepted facts. Right? I'm only going to focus on the disputed facts. Understand that when I was young, all of those claims, there was a lot of papers out about Jesus being a mythical creature, that he wasn't really a real historic feature. Those have been so thoroughly debunked that even skeptics, the harshest skeptics of Christianity, Bart Ehrman and other people that are very skeptical of Christianity, agree on those basic facts. There are still, you can find idiots anywhere. There'll be idiots saying that Jesus is mythological, but credible scholars don't dispute it. So Proposition X is, does the God described in the Bible exist? And Proposition Y is, did Jesus rise from the grave? And, like I said, Proposition Y will have impact on Proposition X. They're two questions, but they're interconnected. And so some arguments are going to have overlap, preventing them from being considered completely independent lines of argumentation. This is true, like in my court case scenario before, when you're making a cumulative. A lot of times, the pieces of evidence have overlapping. You might have 2 or 3 pieces of evidence that show the person was at the scene of the crime. Right? They overlap, but they're not redundant. So a related proposition is that the books of the Bible are reliable sources of information for what Christians claim are the attributes of their God and the facts surrounding his life, death, and claimed resurrection of Jesus. And I'm going to use the Bible for what the Bible teaches who God is and what the Bible says Jesus did, and say this is an accurate representation of Christian belief, rather than somebody's interpretation of Scripture, whatever. I'm saying Scripture is my source. Not saying it's true, that the claims are true. I'm not presupposing the claims are true. I'm saying that they're accurate in what they describe. And then the other piece, how convincing or unconvincing a person finds any piece of evidence is very subjective. If you ever serve on a jury trial, you'll see this. Some jurors will find one piece of evidence stronger than and another juror might say, I wasn't convinced by that, but this piece of evidence really spoke to me. And then, that's true. So as we go through this, if you're going to stick with me for 3 days, my suggestion is you take a piece of paper and a pen, and you look at these arguments, and as I complete each one, you write down, am I only 30% convinced of that argument? Am I 50? Am I 60? Does this argument really speak to me? And I'm 70 or 80% convinced by it. Any rating you give it under 50% is indicating that the point in the argument in places does not support the veracity of the claim, does not support the claim that God exists or that Jesus got out of the tomb. Anything over 50% is an indication of being convinced that this point in the argument is a piece of evidence. It does support the veracity. It doesn't prove the veracity. It just supports it. The greater distance away from 50%, either below or above, the further you get away, is the more convincing you find each argument. And when making judgments about the veracity of an argument, right? Like I said, this is super subjective. But if we're more than 50% convinced that the proposition is likely true, that is belief. If we're under 50%, that's disbelief. That from 0 to 50, or 49.99, is disbelief. And 50.001 to 100 is belief. You're very rarely going to be right in that 50-50. But for the reasons I don't expect to achieve absolute certainty concerning any proposition or absolute belief or disbelief. But I either believe or disbelieve each proposition in life, not just these, each proposition, with different degrees of certainty. Sometimes my certainty approaches 100%. Well, I've repeated myself here, and sometimes it's way less. Sometimes I'm very close to 0, and sometimes I'm much closer to 50%. So with that background, here's the first philosophical argument I looked at. It's called the ontological argument. Ontology is the nature of something, right? And Anselm of Canterbury first put this out. And it's an a priori argument, posits that God, as the greatest conceivable being, must exist in reality because existence is a perfection. Modern versions, and I'll get into Plantinga's because in a little bit, but his definition is God is defined as a being which no greater can be conceived. that God's greater than anything that can be conceived. And that is the biblical presentation of who God is. So his first premise is this concept exists in the understanding, even for the fool who denies God. Even for atheists, they understand what we're claiming about God. They use our definition of God. Premise 2, it is greater to exist in reality, in the than in the mind, in the intellect, right? Alone. If God exists only in the mind, then a greater being can be conceived, one that exists in reality. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being, God, must exist in reality. Now, philosophically, this is a philosophical, rigorous argument. But it's like, okay, there's not evidence. That's just you thinking about it. If I can conceive of God existing and God's the greatest ever, then he must actually exist. In Descartes' ontological argument, and this is my René Descartes, so I blame for my Cartesian doubt, right? He argued that the existence is a necessary property of a supreme being. Whoever you think of as God, God cannot be a created being. He cannot be a contingent being. He has to be a necessary being. So his premise 1 is God is defined as a supremely perfect being. Necessary existence is a perfection, and a perfection is inseparable from the essence of God. Christians do not believe in an imperfect God. Therefore, the Christian God must be a necessary being. If he's a necessary being, therefore it's impossible to conceive of God as not existing. Just as impossible to conceive of a triangle without 3 sides. God is, by his nature, must exist because God, by definition, is a necessary being. Now, Alvin Plantinga, I don't always agree with him, but he is, in my opinion, the greatest living Christian philosopher. If you like philosophy at all, I highly recommend Plantinga's books. Okay? So this modern version suggests that if it's possible that a maximally great being, an all-powerful, all-knowing God exists in any possible world, then by definition, that being must exist in all possible worlds, including the actual world. The possibility of a maximally great being, MGB, is metaphysically possible that a maximally great being exists. It's possible that God exists. And there's a possible world where it does exist. Then if it exists in one world, that maximally great being has to exist in all worlds. Right? So a being with maximal greatness, he must present that greatness in every possible world. And if you are not used to having your mind bent, the multiverse theory, in fact, I'm watching a series on Netflix that's kind of delving into this, is the idea that there's a bunch of different realities, universes, realities. And he's saying if a maximally great being can exist in one of them, and clearly, if we're trying to imagine all these possible things, we can imagine one where one exists, then logically he has to exist in all of them to be maximally great. And from possible to actual, because the actual world is one of the possible worlds, if a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then from step 2, it must exist in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great being, God, exists. So these are philosophical arguments and presented in syllogisms like that, right? So I sat down and looked at these and I said, well, what are the strengths of these arguments? These versions of the argument, they're logically rigorous. They avoid empirical contingencies, Plantinga's version argues that if God's existence is possible in any world, it is necessary in all worlds. Its appeal is found in demonstrating God's necessity without relying on observation. Now, people have come out and claimed there's weaknesses. Now, Kant pre-existed Plantinga, but Kant criticized the ontological argument as it treats existence as a predicate, which is invalid according to Kant. It assumes that conceivability of perfection implies reality, which empiricists, people that are data-driven like me, reject as unverifiable. Modal versions face issues with the possibility premise, often seen as question begging. So those are real weaknesses. But the rebuttal to those weaknesses, the begging the question fallacy, in Latin as petitio principale, is an informal fallacy in a form of circular reasoning where premises assume the truth of its conclusion rather than supporting it. It occurs when the claim to be proven that God exists is implicitly or explicitly assumed within the supporting evidence, providing no actual proof. These arguments could be a type of begging the question, just as the assumption of naturalism mandates a conclusion that a maximally great being doesn't exist. However, in a different argument, Plantinga makes the case that belief in God is properly basic, and I'll deal with what is properly basic or brute fact as we go on with this, right? And that there's other things that we assumed in logic that are not, we don't support with evidence. And so there's your rebuttal. And then I had to come up with an analysis. How convincing did I find these arguments? And I want you to make your own analysis. How solid are they? All right? And without considering the rebuttals to the claimed weaknesses, I would have leaned towards unconvincing. The weakness in the assumptions outweigh the logical strengths, making it less than 50% convincing as a standalone proof. However, once those rebuttals are considered, the evidence shifts to slightly greater than 50%, right? But I'm not saying much over 50%. I ended up at about 52% convincing, barely over, in only the proposition X, that God is verified. So I didn't personally find any of these three versions of the ontological argument super convincing. They're interesting. They're worth discussing. But for me, and like I said, I'm more evidence-based, and these are more theoretical-based. I was at like 52%. Maybe you're at 60. Maybe you're didn't get over the 50%. Now, Plantinga's argument that God is properly basic, and you got to understand what properly basic means, right? These are beliefs that we have to agree. We have to assume that we're real, that we are, our senses are reliable, that our logic is legit, right? Those are properly, and not all rational beliefs need to be inferred from other evidence. Beliefs like I see a tree. When you see a tree, you don't go, do I really see a tree? Is that tree really there or whatever? We assume that tree is real when we see it. Okay? And the sensus divinis, following John Calvin, Plantinga suggests that God designed human beings with a sense of divinity, an innate tendency to recognize God's presence in nature, in guilt, in gratitude, or in danger. And let me tell you, people that, both my father and my father-in-law talked about their battles in World War II and said there are no atheists in a foxhole. Everybody in there in the middle of the fight is a believer in God. He may forget it when he gets out of the fight, but they are there. And that's kind of what they're saying, is that we have that sense of God. Paul in Romans says the heavens declare his glory. The creation declares God's existence. People have a innate ability. And for a belief to be properly basic, it must be produced by cognitive facilities, your properly functioning brain, functioning in a suitable environment aimed at truth. And unless the world is here intentionally to deceive us, and we're looking at it, then if God exists and created us to know him, then belief in his existence is warranted as a properly basic belief. This is highly controversial in Christian circles because this is what's called a presuppositional argument. Just like all the other brute facts are presuppositional. And then he says, it's non-inferential. I didn't get to this knowledge of God the way I'm trying to do this through evidence. He's saying your knowledge of God's in your soul. It's a hole in your soul that only God can fill. And it was put there by God. And so believing that God exists based on that hole is as legitimate as believing that you exist or that your senses are there or that logic. So his first premise is a belief is properly basic, rationally, without needing evidence, if it's produced by cognitive facilities, your brain functioning properly in an appropriate environment according to a design plan successfully aimed at truth. Premise 2, belief in God is produced by such cognitive facilities, a sensus divinis, in an appropriate life-situated circumstances. Therefore, belief in God is properly basic and can be rational. And let me tell you, when Plantinga put this out, it was back when I was in college. In philosophy classes all around the world, basically God had been dead. They killed him, and it was there. And Plantinga and what's his name, Richard Swinburne from Oxford, were putting out arguments for God's existence to turn the world of philosophy on their head. And this is one of them, because this is hard. This is philosophically very rigorous. But it undermines evidentialism demand for evidence, because Plantinga effectively shows that classical evidentialists' objection that belief in God is irrational without sufficient evidence rely on an overly restriction, a foundationalism that fails on its own terms. Many everyday rational beliefs lack inferential support. We accept them without issue. You believe you exist. You believe it's really you hearing me, that I'm really talking to you, that, you believe your senses are real. Where's your evidence for that? We accept those. Parallels with uncontroversial basic beliefs. The analogy to perceptual beliefs. I see a tree. Memory beliefs. Or, we believe our memories are real, right? Belief in other minds, they're compelling. These are non-inferential, yet they're rational. Why couldn't theistic belief similarly, if triggered by experiences like the grandeur of nature or a sense of the divine forgiveness, be real? Right? And so that's hard to debate. And critics really, what you will get from them if you present Plantinga's argument is a lot of historiography. I mean, they get crazy and emotional, but actually breaking this down on a philosophical basis is not that easy. And it shifts the burden of proof. Rather than the theist needing to prove God's existence, Plantinga's argument, the atheist must show why theistic belief could not be properly basic via present the defeater, right? It levels the playing field. Epistemology is the study of how we know things. How do you know what's true? Internal coherence. If theism is true, if God exists and designed humans to know him, as many theistic traditions claim, including Christianity, then faculties like the sensitive divinus, our sense of the divine, producing basic belief, make sense. The argument is conditionally powerful. It shows theistic belief can be rational, assuming theism. It avoids fideism is like a assuming a conclusion. Plantinga insists that properly basic beliefs aren't immune to the objection or defeat. They can still face rational scrutiny, arguments, or defeaters, like the problem of evil, distinguishing his view from like a blind faith, this fideistic belief. Now, people that object to this put up what's called the Great Pumpkin objection, which is almost laughable, but critics ask why belief in God is properly basic and not arbitrary as an absurd belief like the Great Pumpkin or Zeus or fairies. Plantinga replies that proper basicality depends on actual triggering conditions and facilities. Theists experience circumstances like sensing God's presence in creation, while the Great Pumpkin believers don't. But many find this response as an ad hoc or insufficiently principled, without a general criterion for proper basicality. They're saying, basically, you seem to have made up your own definition along the way. They claim it's circular reasoning or question begging. The full warrant means that you have good reason for something in philosophy. The full warrant depends on the truth of theism. The design plan succeeds only if God exists and designed the sensus divinus. Critics makes this argument circular. Belief in God is warranted if theism is true. It doesn't help to establish theism for non-theists, right? And disanalogy, that just means lack of similarity with ordinary basic beliefs. And this is the strongest argument against us to me. Unlike perception or memory, right, which are widely shared and hard to reject without self-defeat, the sensus divinus isn't universal. Not everybody believes it. Many sincere, reflective people lack theistic experiences and form atheistic beliefs instead. High-stakes, controversial beliefs, unlike everyday ones, arguably demand more scrutiny or evidence, especially when they lead to significant life commitments. Also, the other presuppositions we assume as brute facts are necessary for the methodology of evidential examination. However, the presupposition of God as a brute fact is assuming the conclusion, even if it's justified for considering God's properly basis. Even if Plantinga is right about everything he argues and that God is properly basic, you are assuming the conclusion. That seems to be a pretty strong weakness for this being there. Independence on prior theoretical commitments. Some argue, critics drawing from perception epistemology, how you know things to be true is you interact with them, and even perception memory beliefs rely on background inferential assumptions and theoretical beliefs, undermining their strict basicality. If so, theistic beliefs, right, can't be purely basic either. So they undermine all the other properly basic facts to wipe out God being properly basic. And it doesn't resolve the de facto objection. De facto objections to God is that it's not rational to believe in God. Even if God's real, it's not rational. And it doesn't settle whether God actually exists. Does God in fact believe? Okay, de facto is does God in fact believe, and the de jure objection is it's irrational. I think I said that backwards, but this is an attack on the de jure objection to belief in God, Plantinga's argument. So the fact that it doesn't resolve the de facto objections is another one of those kind of like the Great Pumpkin objection. It's laughable because it shows a lack of understanding of the issue. In a lack of non-question begging criteria, Plantinga avoids giving a full general account of proper basicality to prevent self-undermining. But this leaves the view vulnerable to charges of special pleading or for religious belief. So let's look at these claim weaknesses. And I've already told you some of them I find stronger than others. And some, like the Great Pumpkin, are laughable. They're not even remotely reasonable objections, right? The Great Pumpkin rebuttal is invalid because there's no evidence that a properly functioning brain, cognitive abilities, will logically result in the belief in the Great Pumpkin. The claim that it doesn't address the de facto objection to God only defeats the de jure objection almost made me laugh, because Plantinga clearly states the argument is aimed at the de jure objections. De facto objections are, does God actually exist? He's dealing with this argument, is it reasonable? Is it warranted to believe God exists? Right? The one objection that has some merit to me is that other things that we consider properly basic are necessary to assume to allow evidential arguments to proceed. They're part of your methodology. This is a properly basic belief that's no longer part of your methodology, but it's actually there. So I would say that's the strongest criticism of Plantinga's argument here, is that he's kind of changed the reasons why we would accept something as properly basic. So what's some relative value in a cumulative case argument, right? It's widely recognized as one of the most sophisticated defense of rational theistic belief without traditional evidence. It's a presuppositional argument, right? It shifted much of the contemporary philosophy of religion away from evidentialist assumptions towards externalist and contextual models for justification. I'm telling you, Plantinga has turned the world of philosophy on its head. Okay? And Plantinga and Swinburne, two people in modern times that, through their arguments, and I find Plantinga's argument stronger than Swinburne, it just absolutely did it. And this was going on when I was in college, right? So it was a hot topic. But I remain bothered by the categorical differences between assumptions made to facilitate a methodology and an assumption made which presupposes a conclusion, right? And despite that difficulty, I still find this argument leans towards verifying the proposition that God exists. At least it supports the idea that belief in God is rational, right? But how close do I get? Again, this doesn't push me very close to the 100%. I think because of its weaknesses, I'm only at 55% convinced that God exists because of this argument. I am convinced that belief in God would have philosophical warrant because of this argument, but not that de facto argument. Does God actually exist? Because it's not a de facto argument, right? The next argument is called the cosmological argument, sometimes called the Kalam cosmological argument. And Al-Ghazali, he first formed this. And the first premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of all its existence, right? And this cause must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and powerful to create the universe. And an infinite regress of causes is impossible, requiring a first uncaused cause. This is kind of a mixture of a scientific and a philosophical argument. But because science has confirmed that the universe does have an existence, long after Kalam came up with this idea and corroborated his premises, makes this stronger. Now, Leibniz is Leibnizian cosmological argument, and Leibniz is another person that reframed this, says everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either the necessity of its own nature or an internal cause. You have two reasons you can exist. Either you necessarily exist or something else caused you to exist. That's true for time, space, matter, energy, the universe, you and I, all things. If the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists, therefore the explanation for the universe is God. And the reason why he's saying the explanation is God is because the explanation for the existence of the universe must be all what we would consider omnipotent. It needs to be omniscient. There's an amazing intellect behind the universe. It has to be all powerful, omnipotent. You have to have all this stuff. It has to exist outside of time, space, matter, and energy. All of those descriptions are descriptions of the Christian God. The strength of these arguments are they align with observable physical evidence, implying temporal origin. It avoids infinite regression. Like what's holding up the earth? An elephant. What's holding up the elephant? He's standing on the back of another elephant. Those are kind of infinite regressions. By positing that there must be a necessary being, a first uncaused cause to do this. William Lane Craig uses this cosmological argument all the time. He's probably the most popular person promoting this right now. Now, quantum physics might allow uncaused events, like vacuum fluctuations. Okay? There's no evidence, scientific evidence, to show that it will, but in theory, theoretical physics have proposed there might have been a flux in a quantum field. Well, the question is, who created the quantum field? What caused the flux, right? It doesn't get around the problem. And the who caused God objection persists, but the who caused God argument misunderstands the question, right? So let's look at the rebuttals to these claimed weaknesses, right? Neither quantum physics or any other branch of physics has explained the cause of the singularity called the Big Bang or creation. All Big Bang models start a fraction of a second after the explosion, after the Big Bang, after that singularity, right? Laboratory experiments, which rely on input from a scientist, a mind, conducting the experiment, provide evidence of the need for the mind controlling the creation of the universe. The Big Bang model starts a fraction of a second after because they have no time or space for cause and effect. They have nothing to explode, and they have no reason for it to explode. They have to start after the explosion, and they pretend that that's an explanation, right? The attributes that such a necessary first cause must necessarily possess match exactly the attributes ascribed to the Christian God. The who created God objection is a logical fallacy, in that it assumes that if God exists, that God must also have a cause. But God exists. If God exists, God must be a necessary being and therefore be an uncaused cause of all other things. The objection often rests on a misunderstanding or misapplication of necessity. If God metaphysically necessary, self-sustaining, non-contingent being, no eternal cause is required, no external cause, avoiding the regress. Critics assume that necessity still demands explanation, is contested as conflating logical consistency with metaphysical necessity. And this is the problem. You have people that don't understand the terms offering objections, but they're there. The objection failed to account for the distinctions between types of causes: temporal, in time, and atemporal, outside of time, or explanations, personal agency versus mechanical laws, where God as a timeless, atemporal, necessary being can initiate without prior causation, but natural forces can't. Immanuel Kant viewed it as revealing the argument's reliance on a defective ontological assumptions, what's the nature of things, where necessity is presupposed circularly. But the argument doesn't engage in circular reasoning by assuming a conclusion. It simply asserts the possibility of God existing, and if God exists, then he would, by definition, need to be a necessary being, rendering Kant's objection defeated. In addition, Altman Plantinga has made the case that belief in God is properly basic, without which further undermines Kant. So Kant's making a de jure objection, not a de facto objection, and his arguments have been defeated. Bertrand Russell, who is not an impressive philosopher to me, I waited years to read him, and I was seriously disappointed. He is not a sophisticated mind. Suggested the universe could be a brute fact without a cause, paralleling God's exemption. But scientific evidence shows that the universe had a beginning. So he's proposing something that is in contradiction of all known science, and assuming that that's a reasonable objection. Like I said, I was seriously underwhelmed with Bertrand Russell's ability to think and reason. But how strong is this? Well, this argument, combined with scientific corroboration of the need of a first uncaused cause, I think is one of the strongest philosophical arguments out there. Right? And it got me up to like a 65%. And that, as a singular argument, that is one of the strongest ones I came up with. This is there because you have to admit, just thinking about it, if everything that exists either is uncaused and is necessary, right, self-existent, or it has a cause, and nothing that we know of other than God is an uncaused necessary cause. The universe, not time, not space, not the quantum field, none of that is an uncaused necessary cause. The only sufficient proposed uncaused necessary first cause of all other things is God, and it is backed up by science. That hit me strong when I was first doing this. But I told you I started with this. Objective moral values cannot exist without God. Right? You can have subjective moral values. I have friends who are atheists, who are very moral people. They have their own subjective things. But nothing is objectively wrong to them. And I've made this argument to them. In what universe and what place is torturing children to death for fun morally okay? And nobody that I know that's not psychotic agrees that that would ever be okay. So they agree that is morally wrong in every situation, in any place, and at any time. That would be one objective moral value. If one objective moral value exists, an objective moral lawgiver must exist. Because you have no other source. Why would it exist? And human intuition of objective morality. There's universal condemnation of genocide supports a transcendent source. Evolutionary ethics struggle and normativity, right? That we just agreed upon these morals for the benefit of our own selves do not explain that. Now, the weakness here, it came from Plato. It's called Euthyphro's dilemma. And he asked, is it good because God commands it, or is it independent? Is it good because God says so, or is good independent of God, basically? And so the problem is with Euthyphro's dilemma is Plato failed to understand that in the idea of a Christian God, goodness is his nature. It's not something separate from God. Goodness comes from within God, and it emanates from his own being, invalidating his dilemma completely. It's not good because God says it's good, nor is it good because something outside of God determines what is good. Goodness emanates from the nature of God himself. And therefore Euthyphro's dilemma is invalid. The claim of secular ethics, right, or alternate explanations for morality, presupposes that no objective moral values exist, right? All moral values are decided on by persons or communities or societies. This was Germany's argument, that who are we to judge them? Their society decided what was okay. But the existence of an objective moral value, any objective moral value, proves it is. And like I said, I gave you one example. There are other examples of objective moral values existing, and I think any reasonable person would have to conclude that certain things are objectively and always morally wrong or morally right. But so this is another strong argument. But again, I only get the 60% convincing. And I suggest you put your own numbers. Maybe you find this 80%. Maybe you find it 51%. Maybe you don't find it convincing at all. But you look at these, put in your own numbers, right? And then in this foregoing, I looked at the arguments for philosophical arguments for God exists. I looked at a few of them. I tried to make the same number arguments for each one. I combined various arguments into the ontological argument into a single one to avoid as much overlap as possible. That left me with 4 types of philosophical arguments. And while some claim witnesses didn't stand up to scrutiny, each argument had its own strengths and weaknesses. None were overpowerfully convincing. None of them were what I would call a smoking gun level of evidence. Right? But each of the arguments, I concluded that they all pointed more towards it likely being God exists than it likely is not. The ontological arguments only convinced me 52%. That God is properly basic is more philosophically rigorous to me, and it got me to 55. The cosmological argument that you need an explanation for the existence of anything, and God is the best explanation that anything exists rather than nothing. The cosmological argument I found very strong at 65%. I'm not overrating these. I'm not saying that got me to 95%. I'm saying 65. I'm being super conservative here. And objective moral values, I'm only saying 60%. You might have different numbers. I suspect many of you will. But if you keep them down and just keep track of what they are as we go through this for 3 days, I think you're going to be surprised what happens. Because while being only 52 or 65% convinced the proposition X that the God of the Bible does exist, they're all over 50%. They all lead me fall on the side of the scale that God more likely exists than does not. Right? But critics say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they consider the existence of God to be an extraordinary claim. And I disagree with the premise, but it raises a reasonable question. How convinced would I need to be that God described in the Bible exists to make that belief part of my own worldview? Would 51% do it? At 55? Where were you at? And another philosopher, Blaise Pascal, addressed this very question. His conclusion is known as Pascal's wager. It's the gamble. Pascal argues that everybody wagers in their life on whether or not God exists. Every time you make a decision on this question, you're placing a bet. If you believe God and you are right, you gain eternal life, infinite gain. If you wrong, you lose little. What did you lose? If you do not believe in God and you're wrong, you risk infinite suffering in hell. And he said, belief is the only rational choice because of the potential gain is infinite and the potential loss is infinite, regardless of the probability of God's existence. He's saying it only makes sense to bet that God exists because of the consequences. I mean, honestly, if you lived your life as a moral human being and tried to do good in the world and tried to follow the example of Christ, and it turned out when you died that there was no heaven, what did you lose? But if you decide to live any way you want and believe God doesn't exist and deny God and you're wrong, you lose everything. So I've done these philosophical arguments, and I got a variety between 52 and 55 or 65%, right? But hasn't modern science already disproved God's existence? And maybe looking at scientific evidence will shift the scale from my greater than 50 to less than 50, right? I'm on the positive side of belief here, but certainly if I go back and look at the scientific evidence that reportedly makes God unnecessarily, then maybe I'll go back to disbelief. And that's what I'm going to do Wednesday. That was my next step. And I told you, you're getting a glimpse inside my mind, and it may be disturbing what you get looking there, how my brain works. But I went through this systematically, and I said, okay, these are the philosophical arguments, and yeah, I mean, they all kind of point to God, but I'm not super convinced by any of them. What about the science? Science is more fact. Science talks to me, okay? It's how my brain functions, right? So if you're new here, it is my practice that I usually, when I'm done the teaching, I put on a video, and then I'm going to try to read the chat, and I'll be back after this song, and I will talk to you. I see some questions and comments in the chat. I will try to address them when I get back here.
alone. You will come to take me home.
You are all I ever need. Jesus, you have set me free. I will worship you alone. You will come to take me home. You are all I ever
You are all I need.
Jesus, you have set
You
me
set me free.
I will worship you
I will
alone.
worship you.
You will come to take me home.
I've fallen on my knees. I will bless the Lord. Do, 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 do. Oh, oh, oh.
Okay, I got a great question out of YouTube. Do ontological arguments commit what's called the existential fallacy? Are they defining God into existence? This is exactly what Kant was arguing, that it's a fallacy to add the necessity of being into the definition, to move the belief in God out of a concept in your mind to a necessary reality. When you do that by defining God as necessarily existing, that you're committing this existential fallacy. And it's one of the reasons that I do not hold the ontological arguments. I didn't, what did you see me put them? I put them at 52% convincing. They lean towards belief in God, but they're not super convincing to me because I recognize that weakness. I don't think they actually commit that fallacy, but and Plantinga argued this, that they're not technically flawed in that they commit the fallacy, but the problem is that not everybody agrees with the premise, that next conclusion. And I think that's a serious weakness in those arguments. And it's why I don't find them super convincing. I mean, they point me towards belief, but they don't get me anywhere near being convinced in that belief. And if I was only 52% convinced that God existed, would I really change my life? Maybe because Pascal's wager, I would still choose to bet on the side if I was only 52% convinced. But those arguments, yeah, that's a serious weakness in ontological arguments, and it's a good question. Sounds like I had somebody that studied a little philosophy here. But it's that's why I don't do that. Whereas I found the arguments on the existence of the necessary cause. You need a necessary cause that causes all other contingent things. Everything that's contingent, everything that has a cause, that came into existence. Everything that came into existence needs a cause. You have to have an explanation for that. Something either eternally, necessarily exist, or if it's contingent and it came into existence, you have to have a cause. And naturalism offers not an insufficient cause for the universe, for life, for thought, for things like math, physics, all that stuff, all the laws of physics. Naturalism does not offer a sufficient cause to explain why they came into existence or how they came into existence. And, so theism, the belief in an omniscient, omnipotent, self-existent God, is a sufficient cause. And that's why I found that more stronger. But even then, you see me, I'm only 65% convinced of that. But that gets you a question. If you're 65% convinced God exists, would that be sufficient for you to give your life to him? Interesting, right? We're on day 1. Let's say 3-day argument. And at the end of 3 days, I'm not going to be at 52 or 65% convinced. I'm going to be a lot closer to that 99% convinced at the end of 3 days. And I'm going to explain to you how I got there. So with that, I went over time on these subjects, and I'll try not to go over time on Wednesday because I don't want to step on Michael, but I may. But God willing, I will be back on Wednesday and do this. And if you're new here, I stream Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Pacific time. Rumble, X, D Live, Donahue Papa. That's where I started on the internet, was as Donahue Papa, because I am Donahue Papa in my family. There's too many papas, so I'm Donahue Papa. And when I got the pilled Foxhole, the little comfy bunker over there, I messed up Donahue Papa so bad that we started over with a new account called Bill Donahue. It was FooBar, couldn't fix it. And then when I went to YouTube, I couldn't get any of the accounts I asked for, so I am Discerning Truth 534. So those are the two oddballs. Anywhere else, I'm Donahue Papa. And on Fridays, I joined Neil. I love Neil. I officiated a marriage between Neil and Ron in Chicago. She reads the Bible with her Bible buddies and talks about it and thinks about Scripture openly Monday to Friday. She still uses Chicago time zone, the Central time zone, and she's usually on by 10:15, almost certainly by 10:30 Central time, Monday to Friday. And then on Fridays, I join her and we discuss whatever's on Neil's mind from the week. Maybe questions coming out of my stream, maybe questions that come up in her stream. If you want to listen to this again, replays are easier on Rumble. This will be in a channel on God, right? And so underneath Donahue Papa, I have 14 channels. A Start Here channel, New Testament books channel, Old Testament books. This will be a channel. It's going to have God in the label, right? And then on YouTube, they allow you to have as many playlists as you want. So again, the playlist will be about God, and it'll be on YouTube. But it allows me to arrange my replays by subject matter. So if you can go on Rumble and like the 14 channels, that's the only problem with Rumble is you gotta like all 14 channels. Or you don't have to. If you don't like one of them, like Freaky Fridays, you go, I don't want to listen to that nonsense. I'm not going to listen to Freaky Fridays. You can not like that one. But on YouTube, if you like Discerning Truth 534, you don't have to go like each playlist. And then if you want my notes, after I get off the air, I will create a PDF. I will upload it on Discerning Truth groups on Telegram. You can download it for free. Nothing I do is behind a paywall. All my stuff I do for God, and I put it out there. And if you want to use it and it benefits you, God bless you. I'm very happy with that ability to give that blessing to you. For those people that drop gold pills on Foxhole or send me cash apps or buy books or whatever, I appreciate your support, but you don't owe me anything, right? And then I always promote my good friend Michael Beatty, California, singer, songwriter extraordinaire, memer, turned into an amazing memer. He's a political, what do you call it? He's the bane of the existence of liberals and the woke right. And he's out there, but he's teaching the Bible now 7 days a week. Saturday is pre-recorded, and it's just the proverb of the day. But Sunday is Psalms, and Monday through Friday he's in the book of the Bible. I haven't listened to the replay yet. I still think he's in the book of John, but I haven't listened. He might have finished John. He was getting pretty close. And Michael's there at 5:30 a.m. in the morning. I mentioned the replay because I live in Hawaii. and 5:30 a.m. West Coast time is 2:30 a.m. here. So don't expect to see me in Michael's chat. Okay, if I'm up at 2:30, something's seriously wrong. But with that, I'm going to get out of here for today. God bless you all for listening, and hopefully you'll come back Wednesday for part 2, when we're going to look at the scientific arguments for God's existence. What? I thought science disproved God. Maybe. Maybe not. Thank you.
Your worries and troubles, fear is not from above. Walk boldly and bless those around you. Exhort mercy and love. Even when the darkness may surround us, He's the Father that won't let go. Walk through the fire, His name lifted higher. Nothing can ever separate from the love